Hello and welcome to Design Alpha. Today I'll be going over how to apply basic textures onto objects using Enscape together with SketchUp. The four texture examples I'll be using are glass, concrete, metal, and wood. I'll also go into depth on how to use Enscape's material editor settings to adjust your textures to look as realistic as possible. Like and subscribe if you enjoy, and let's get started. Okay, so before we start applying any textures within SketchUp itself, we first want to download them. Now, by all means, you can use what is already available within Enscape. However, I personally like to use this website here called Quixel Megascans, and you can download pretty much any texture you want for free, and in my opinion, they're of much higher quality and a lot more professional for the kind of projects you want to be using. So just about like this, I'll try to also link in the description below and hit enter on that. And go ahead and click on the first link up here. Now, Quixel bases its website off of Epic Games, so to be able to download any of these textures you see here, you will be asked to create something along the lines of, I think it's called a content license from Epic Games. Now, this is completely free to be made as long as you have your own Epic Games license, which is once again also free. So the requirements you will need to have to be able to download these textures is simply an Epic Games license and to apply for that content ID, which will show up when you try to download any of the textures anyway. But once you have those set, you'll be ready to start downloading anything you want. Alright, so once you've made sure that you're all signed in to Quixel, you'll see this little person icon up here to show that you are signed in. You want to go on to the left here to where it says under Home, and it has all these different names here. We're going to be working with surfaces. Those are just basic 2D textures. You click on that and it has a whole list of all these different types of textures that you can apply to your model. And it, for my purposes, as said in the intro, I'll just be downloading concrete, glass, wood, and metal. But obviously you can download whatever you want from any different subcategory and apply it to your model just the same way. Once you've found a texture you're happy with, click on it and it'll come up with this preview here showing its closest view with all of its small imperfections and details. And down here on the bottom left where it says render, it will show that there's one of 3 pages. Moving to the right, it will just show a tonal render of the texture without any of its actual texture. It's PNG, it's just showing the bump map and just the negatives in the photo. And then moving to the right one will show the texture zoomed out a little bit more. And you can, on the bottom right, choose the quality you're looking for. I always go for 2K because unless you have a computer that can even run 4K, the differences between the two can be very minute depending on how close you're rendering, but it can make a huge difference into the file size of your model that you're trying to work with. And 8K, it's very rare you would even be able to have a computer that can show that level of quality and detail anyway. So 2K is more than enough and still has a great amount of detail and quality for your project. There is also more settings that go into more detail on the right here, choosing what it already comes with, being albedo, normal, displacement maps, and a load more different settings you can turn on or off, but I always just basically leave it as is. Once you're happy with everything, just go ahead and click download and save it to wherever you want on your computer. When downloading your texture file, it will appear as a compressed file version, and you'll know it's compressed because it has this zipper kind of icon in front of the folder. You don't want it to have that icon there, you want it just to be the normal folder. And you never want to be extracting any of the textures or any of the other PNGs, JPEGs, any of that from a compressed version. So to decompress this file, it is as simple as right-clicking on the folder and going down to this icon here where it says extract all. And then it'll pop up with this message here and you just simply press extract. Now, if I click into the opened folder, you can see that now it no longer has that zip icon. All my files are there. Once you've finished downloading all your textures, you're going to be ready to move into SketchUp. So I've just opened up SketchUp on the left here and Enscape on the right. And the objects I'll be using to apply the textures to are just going to be these 4 plain basic blocks here. And I've specifically left in the human model on the left side for reference to scale, which I will be making reference to later as I go into more depth into applying settings on the textures themselves to add realism. So to retrieve the text from wherever you saved them onto your computer, you are going to want to first open up the materials section within SketchUp. So your right panel might be all closed off like this. Just go to where it says materials and click on the drop down. And from there, you're going to want to go to this little icon here, which is like a SketchUp symbol with a plus, and it's called Create Material. Click on that, and then go down to this bottom right one here, which is a folder icon called Browse for Material Image File, and open that up. Once clicking on the icon, you're going to want to navigate to wherever you saved the texture onto your computer, the same texture you're trying to apply onto your objects. Once you have found it and opened it, for me this would be this wood veneer texture here, you're going to just want to click onto the image file that shows the texture in its normal state. This would be this file over here labeled albedo. The other files you do not want to touch unless you know what you're doing. There are other ways you can use these files to adjust the different settings within the texture. That's what these different files mean and stand for. But if you just want to simply apply the texture as is to your object, you're just gonna click on the file labeled with albedo, followed by open, and then OK. Now you'll see your texture has been loaded into this right bar here, and it will automatically come up with a paint bucket like this. But let's say if you're using another tool and you want to learn how to go back to that texture, you can go straight to the paint bucket tool up here, but I prefer just clicking directly onto the texture and it will automatically bring up the same tool either way. Now zoom into whichever object you're working on, and it's as simple as using your left mouse button to click onto whatever face you want to apply the texture. Just like so. Now, if you wanted to make each individual side a certain texture, or perhaps you want to have them facing a certain way, you want them to all be different, that's fine. You would not have to do this next step that I'm about to do. But if you wanted to make your life easier and simply apply textures on the entire block, for example, instead of one face, all in one go, there is a way you can do that. If I Control Z to let it go back to its plain state and go up here to the select tool, which is this cursor icon, then make sure this block is lined up to fit into the whole part of the screen, and holding down my left mouse button, select the entire cube. It will all highlight blue like this. Then I would right click with my mouse until this menu pops up and go down to here where it says Make Group. Clicking on this button, now you can see that the cube is no longer highlighting one face, but instead a blue line outline of the entire block. Now if I go over to the texture, same process, clicking on it and dragging it over. If I left click again, it applies it to the entire block. I'm going to repeat that step one more time in case you didn't catch that, this time with the metal texture onto this second block here. Same process, going to the under the material section, clicking on Create Material, and followed by the Browse for Material Image file, navigating to wherever you save the texture onto your computer. And once you've located that texture, going to the file labeled albedo, clicking on that, open, and OK. Now this block has already been transformed into a group just to make my life easier, and it is automatically transferred to the bucket tool, so I can just simply left click onto the object and the metal texture has been transferred over into Enscape. For users who are using the inbuilt textures within Enscape's material library, your process of applying textures is still extremely simple and can be completed using the following method. Go up to the Enscape material library icon located up at this top bar here. Opening that will show all the different textures that are provided with Enscape. And for my last one, I'm going to be going for glass. So just going down on the categories panel here and finding glass. And I think I might choose this frosted glass one here. It can be whatever texture you want, but it's the same process with all of them. Click on that texture and you're going to want to just select this import selection button right here. Now it doesn't look like much has happened, but if I now close this, and you can see now this frosted glass 09, Voronoi, or however you pronounce that, has been imported into SketchUp under the Materials tab. And just like with all the other steps, clicking on the material and moving it over to your group block or just a regular block and clicking on it, you can see it has been applied. If you want to change the dimensions or the positioning of a specific texture on a specific side within the SketchUp file, you want to simply highlight that side that you're working on by just left clicking and right click to go down to where it says texture. And before that, you want to click on make a unique texture. Once that has happened, doesn't look like much has changed, but now you are able to right click, go down to texture, and then start clicking on the position. This tool diagram will show up now, and it has these 4 different points, but the main one you're going to mainly want to be using, you can always check each individual point and see what it says if you hover your mouse over it, but the main one I use is just simply the green point on the right here, bottom right, and this allows you, if you hold down your left mouse button, to spin and move and change the texture as much as you want. So let's say you have your wood grain going left to right horizontally like this, but you think, I don't really want that, I want it to be vertical instead. Simple, you can just holding down that left mouse button and moving your mouse, switch that over. And perhaps you're saying to yourself, well, that wood grain looks a bit too big compared to that human-sized model next to it. So if you want to change that, you simply would moving your mouse back and forth like this, you can reduce the size of that texture. However, the downside to this is that if you make it too small, it's quite obvious you can see the texture repeating itself over and over again. For example, you can see all those different wood grain textures being repeated because this is the main texture within the square that's being used. So you would want to try and increase it to a size that adds a bit of variety, and you can always, maybe you want it to be this size for example, and you can always move it around as well to kind of create that illusion that it is a unique and realistic texture. An alternative way to change the texture's size is to go within the texture itself and click on the right where it says edit, and you're going to want to make sure that under this dimension, these dimensions here, which is what we're going to be working with, you want to make sure that they are linked like this, because if they are unlinked, if you do this next step, it's not going to work as you intend. So make this linked, make sure they're linked, and then you are going to be free to change the either number, it doesn't really matter. Let's say for me, I'm trying to reduce the size of this wood grain within this wood texture. So I would highlight that top number there, and let's say I'm going to make a big reduction from 1524 down to somewhere about like 800. And you can see because it has been linked, the bottom millimeter transfers as well, and you can see that the overall texture has been reduced in size. So the texture application part of the video is now complete, but if you want to learn how you can manipulate Enscape's texture settings to make your textures look as realistic as possible, be sure to stick around for the last couple of minutes of this video. Basically, with these 4 textures that I've now laid out from SketchUp onto Enscape, making sure I've got that camera lined up with the other side, I'll start off with the wood texture that I've created, and this I'll now go into detail about why I've decided to keep the human model next to my different blocks, and that is for reference of scale. And this is most pertinent with a wood grain texture, because you want the grain size to be not too small and not too large, because that ruins the whole realism of that image. So if I compare it to the size of the lady I have next to it, you can see that I've using the same technique I showed previously in the earlier part of the video. I lowered the texture size to get this finer grains measurement on the right there in Enscape, and that was simply just done by going into the actual texture itself, editing it, and dragging the image to become smaller. If I click on the actual texture editor up here, and I go down to, this one's named Material 1, right? So this one here. So if you can see, if I compare it to the right image here, you can see that what I've manipulated is this texture part here. I've turned on bump map. So I think before it was rested on normal map. I've switched over to bump, and I've clicked on, it looked like this before, and I've clicked onto where it says use albedo, and just clicked, and it will automatically detect whatever the bump map image is within the texture file. You don't have to even go into your computer and do any of that. If you click on it just like this, it'll pop up just like that. But what the bump map does is essentially, if I zoom in to the wood grain section of the texture, you can almost see that the actual lines within the wood almost look like they're casting a shadow, as if they've been pushed inwards into the piece of wood. This will be more clear when I show off perhaps the concrete texture, but you can adjust whether you want this to be really, really harsh or really soft. I've left it at 8.26 because I believe it looks the most realistic, but it adds a huge deal of realism, especially when you're changing certain lighting, to have that grain casting those minute shadows, especially as on the corners as well, because it sometimes gets rid of those sharp corners that just looks very unrealistic. And if I just change the sun a little bit to make sure it's going the right way, and I can do that by holding shift and moving my mouse while also hitting the right mouse button on my mouse, just making sure that, because lighting can make a difference on how the texture appears. And now the reason I've left the reflections as clear on the wood texture is because wood is not reflective most of the time unless it has a varnish on it. It absorbs most light and just usually casts a shadow behind it, but you wouldn't see much of the ground or the figure being cast onto the actual wood itself. You may see that with a lot of other textures as I'll go down the list. So if I move that over here and then move on to the next texture. So the next one I've got here is going to be a stainless steel metal texture. Now this should be listed under, click on that one here, Material 2. So that's this one here. Now for this one, I have essentially, I've just left the height map and the reflections alone. I tried using the bump map and the reflections to see how it would come out, but I just wasn't happy with how it was going. I thought I could manipulate it to my own liking to get a much better quality of what I was looking for. Now, if I zoom in closely into the actual texture, you can see a lot of these different tiny little miniature parts of the texture. You can kind of see very faintly there, which adds to the realism of the stainless steel look. Now before, those little scratches and little markings were very, very prominent, and that's because the texture was way too large. And as I showed before, I went into the edit, lowered the size down drastically. I think it was at about 1000 before, and it produced a much smaller grain to the metal texture, which made it look a lot more realistic. Now, the most important thing you want to do when it comes to metal is the main parts you're going to be focusing on is within this reflection section here. If you want to get a much more reflective surface, you can do one of two things. You either increase the metallic percentage to the very far right, so for me I've got mine at 90%, or you can reduce the roughness all the way down to the opposite direction, the left, and for me I've got 36.7. Now, if you had roughness all the way up, for example, it would make the metal look more just like plastic, so no reflections. And if you turn the metal all the way down, a very similar thing would happen as well. Now, the only downsides that you should probably take into account is that increasing the metallic value to the right darkens the actual color of the metal, and increasing roughness to the right, yeah, it kind of makes it a little bit lighter in color, as you can see. So just keep that in mind if you're looking for a specific type of colored metal. Maybe you want it to be more dark or lighter. Adjusting those values will affect that. And when it comes to specular, you can just basically leave that alone. Changing it forward or back doesn't make much of a difference. But you just want some of those reflections to be showing, so you can see the white ground and if I move the camera here, you can see the wood block sitting next to it. But you don't want it to be over reflective so that it looks like a mirror, or under reflective so that it looks almost like plastic. For me, this is the perfect middle ground. Second last, we have the concrete texture. If I close that, and it's labeled under material 3. So open back this up again and go to material 3 in alphabetical order. Basically, for this one, very similar to the wood grain, the bump map is very important for this. So I've turned on the bump map by clicking use albedo, and I've turned it quite to a rather high number. And the reason for that is that when I'm moving those shadows, you can see the different cracks in the concrete being casted as the shadow. And if you look carefully enough, you also have an illusion created where that sharp edge on the actual cement block is kind of reduced, and it looks more like a bit of a rough edge that a concrete block would have. For me, the actual size of the texture for the concrete was perfectly fine. I didn't have to change the size at all. And if you see, as I have applied the texture while it's in a group form, as I showed before, you can see parts of the concrete wrapping around the sides, which in my opinion is far more realistic than having different type of directions and different ways the concrete is being shown on each individual side. If it's all in one, it looks a lot more realistic, as if it was one continuous object. And once again, no reflections because it is concrete, and unless it's polished, unless it has paint on it, it shouldn't be reflecting anything. It's completely absorbent of all light. And then finally, we have this glass texture here. Now, glass in Enscape is a bit tough, it's a bit strange. The reason for that is because, first of all, Enscape doesn't actually have its own plain glass texture. So for this, I'm actually using just SketchUp's inbuilt glass texture, which is just the translucent glass gray, which can just be found by clicking into this panel here, going down to glass and mirrors, and it's just this one on the right here. And I find it's probably the best. It's obviously not perfect, but it can get the job done. It's average. If you want, for most of my jobs, I have actually specific custom glass texture that I use, which I might make a video on later down the track. It's a combination of adding in tinted colors within the glass and changing the opacity and adding different effects to the glass. But I have essentially, just for the sake of this video, if you want something quick and easy, just at short notice, just go for the inbuilt SketchUp texture because it works perfectly fine. And so this texture can actually still be modified within the Enscape settings here. Alright, yeah, so it's listed as translucent glass gray, and I only adjusted very specific parts of the settings within Enscape for this texture, and for those ones you're going to be mainly working with the transparency section when you're working with glass. If you want to, you can tick this frosted glass box here. It doesn't really act as you may intend. If you want frosted glass, it's probably best to just look up a frosted glass texture. But when it comes to opacity, before it was set to, I think, 50%, and for me, it just made it look rather translucent from a distance, so it almost looked like there was nothing there. However, I just reduced the opacity a little bit, just down to 44.5, and this just gives it a little bit more realism. Looks like it's more present and that it's a glass block instead of just the thin air. What main things you're looking for is that making sure the reflections are correctly being casted from the glass. If I turn my camera to this angle, for example, it can be seen very easily from the sides. Head on, it's a lot harder to see. And if you're worrying about the flickering effect that's happening when you're turning the camera, if you're rendering still images, this is obviously not a problem, because if you're holding the camera still like this, you can see it settles down, and when you render it, it comes out just perfect. If you're taking animations, it would be an issue. However, this is only occurring because I have made the group all made out of glass, and that includes the bottom part. So the bottom part of this cube is glass, but then the floor is still just the model. So that's why it's creating that flicker effect, because there's two textures being overlapped at once. So if you were to do a glass box like this and you want to do an animation and you don't want that flickering, I would just don't add the texture as a group, just add them individually to each side and forget about the bottom part. Now, of course, it should be noted that the textures don't look completely as realistic as they would and should in a professional complete model. And the reason for that is because I have just a basic bland surrounding background around the actual textures themselves. When you have a full house model or a full any different scenery, even a HDRI or an actual inbuilt background model, you'll see a lot of the different reflections from those objects and that background being casted onto the reflections from the textures. And even objects that I said before had no reflections, such as the wood or the concrete, they would still show very slight signs of objects being present next to them, rather than with no background. It kind of tricks the brain into looking just fake or odd. So if you see them like this, just in a blank background, and they look a bit unrealistic to you, don't worry. If you put them into your actual model and add a lot of scenery behind it, it will look a lot more realistic. That's going to do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, consider liking it and subscribing to my channel for more design-related tutorials posted regularly. Stick around for more exciting features coming soon to Design Alpha.